Good afternoon, everyone. You are welcome to another presentation of the Prentice Institute for Global Population and Demography. My name is Oluwawoshoga. I'm a faculty member with the Faculty of Health Sciences and a research affiliate of the Institute. Dr. Ivan Hansen is a woman geographer with a range of interest in urban, rural, socio-geography. He has worked on issues such as aging, urban impacts of demographic change, residential segregation, geography of deprivation and disadvantaged Aboriginal communities, housing, privatization of space, gated communities, community health, the experiential nature of community, impact of PSC, and the geography of well-being. His recent work has focused on PTSD and resilience in community affected by wildfire and income inequalities within Canadian metropolitan areas. Dr. Townshend is a professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Lethbridge and also a research affiliate of the Prentice Institute for Global Population and Demography, and is the Calgary team leader on a national SHARC-funded project called Neighborhood Change Research Partnership. He is also a collaborator on another SHARC partnership project titled Rural Policy Learning Commons. When he's not working, Ivan is cleverly disguised as an adult and enjoy riding motorcycles. Personally, or on a personal note, I've learned a lot from Ivan during my involvement with him on the wildfire project. So he's a great mentor. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ivan Townshend to the podium.
Thank you, Olu. All right, hopefully the technology all works here. I'm going to turn this a little bit so that I can see what I'm doing. What I wanted to report to you today on is some parts of a project associated with the Neighborhood Change Research Partnership. It's a 7-year SHARC-funded initiative, and I think we're now in about year 6 of this. So what we'll talk about today is how a city like Calgary, the income profile is changing. It's becoming more income unequal, more income polarized. And what we're really looking at today is to ask the question about what kind of social attributes are linked, if you will, to regions of income inequality and change in Calgary. So I'll talk very briefly about the NCRP. Just to give you an introduction of how it arose, I'll talk about this notion of divided cities. A lot of the work of the NCRP is linked to this literature dealing with divided cities. We'll look at some very, very brief evidence of income inequality and polarization in Canadian metropolitan areas. And I'll touch very, very briefly on the notion of the Three Cities model, which was developed by Holchansky in Toronto, which has sort of taken on a life of its own, and as we've been trying to replicate this in other cities. It's a very, very simplistic idea, and I'll come back to that issue later on. Then we'll look at this, having dealt with the Three Cities issue, look at some evidence for increasing or patterns of income change within Calgary and see what's going on over time between 1980 and essentially 2011. And then look at this question of, are there community differences by what are called the three cities, City 1, 2, and 3. And I'll try and link this back at the end of the day to this notion of the theoretical literature on divided cities. So if we look at the NCRP project, this was the team leader for this project is David Holchansky at the University of Toronto. He's in the Faculty of Social Work. His background is in urban planning and social work, but he's also been extensively working on housing for most of his career. Anyway, in 2005, David and a team of others got one of these SHARC Cura grants to begin to look at this issue of increasing polarization and income inequality in Canada, and they focused primarily on Toronto, and this is one of the sort of early publications. Can you guys see the mouse here?
Yes.
Okay, one of the early publications that came out of this. The Cura project also subsequently brought on Vancouver and Montreal to see whether or not similar patterns of evidence were evidence within these cities. And then they used the 2006 census to update the material for those 3 cities. In 2012, we got this partnership grant dealing with 8 metro areas and trying to sort of do cross-comparative research across the 8 metro areas, but also each of the 8 CMAs having a team leader doing all kinds of sort of separate projects within each metropolitan area. Just for example, we also included Chicago, just to provide us with some comparative evidence from the U.S. For those of you who are interested more about this project, you can go to neighborhoodchange.ca. There's dozens and dozens of publications from the group on here, little booklets, things like, for example, inequality, polarization, and poverty. How do we measure it and what does it mean? Little 12-page booklets. They're very, very useful. Things about housing policy in the 21st century. What else do we have in here? Neighborhood collective agency, the literature on divided cities and socio-spatial change, and I'm not going to deal with all of these today. Issues around rental housing, impoverishment and rental housing, these kinds of things. These are booklets, studies we've done on multivariate typologies of neighborhoods in Canada. So again, I'll leave this to you guys if you're interested to go and peruse the website. There's lots and lots of material there. Lit reviews, bibliographies, all kinds of useful things. But to put it in context, the Three Cities of Toronto you can download the Three Cities report. It's a little 20-page booklet, I think. And this little booklet, when it was published, really hit a nerve in Toronto and across the country. It was picked up in the press, in the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star. Volchansky's been on CBC television numerous times discussing this research. People across the country seem to be intrigued by the findings of this, and it's such a simple little idea. And I'll talk a little briefly about this in a few minutes. But the reason for the Three Cities of Toronto report is, excuse me, again goes back to the literature on divided cities. The divided cities literature, there's numerous people working in this area, but 2 of them, the key people are Peter Marcuse and Ronald van Kempen from the Netherlands. But what they argue is that somehow, cities have always been economically divided, but they argue that something new is happening in the post-industrial societies, that there's a new form of separation, a new form of spatial cleavage that's ordered. They call it, perhaps, they're asking the question, is it a new spatial order? They argue that the city is becoming increasingly quartered according to different social segments, different income groups, different ethnic minorities, different racial or visible minority groups. It's becoming more spatially polarized, which again is linked, it is argued, to changing dynamics of income inequality as well. Also, of course, a lot of the impetus for the divided cities literature comes from the changes in governance associated with neoliberalism, primarily from the 1980s onwards, with Thatcher, Reagan, and Mulroney, for example, in Canada, where essentially a dismantling of the welfare state and the privatization of former state involvement. So, go back one moment. One of the terms that was up there that Marcuse used, and I want to come back to this term later on. He argues that the increasingly divided city is one which is a process of invidious differentiation. It's a really interesting term, I think, and one that carries a lot of meaning. So anyway, if you look at the arguments in Marcuse and Van Kempen and all this other literature, Owens, for example, they argue that the city is becoming more and more segmented according to different groups. The affluent are living in citadels, the middle-class suburban community, gentrifying neighborhoods in inner cities, so-called edge cities in the suburban periphery, and exclusive enclaves, like gated communities and so forth. At the same time, the vulnerable, and there's an increasingly vulnerable population, we're seeing the rise of perhaps more ghetto communities, of the excluded immigrant enclaves or ethnoburbs that we talk about in Canada, and of course public housing or welfare communities. The same thing in Europe as well. So this product of invidious differentiation, according to Marcuse, is a form of inequality that reflects a hierarchical relationship, one of domination, subordination, inclusion and exclusion, privilege and deprivation. So others who have looked at this issue of income change around the world, all over the world, people are pointing to unprecedented levels of inequality, income inequality. Douglas Massey, for example, makes a really strong case that really what this is setting in motion is the beginning of the demise of civil society linked to income inequality. Others like Richard Wilkinson have written very populist books that deal with this. For example, The Spirit Level is a terrific read, and books like The Impact of Inequality on Societies. And inequality promotes strategies that are self-interested, less affiliative, antisocial, more stressful, create higher levels of violence, poor community relations, and worse health. And Wilkinson's, if you go on to Google and YouTube, you can watch a whole bunch of his speeches on income inequality. They're terrific, actually. And he makes this really, really interesting case that it is income inequality within a society, not between societies, that really, really matters, because that's where we find the problems. So as Canada, therefore, becomes more unequal, we will face these kinds of social problems that are linked to inequality. If we look at Canadian metropolitan areas, we can see lots of evidence that they're becoming more unequal, but also more polarized. But at the same time, not all cities are experiencing this the same. Some cities experience way more polarization and income than others, and others are less. So there's differences in degree of inequality and polarization across the country, and this part of our project is to try and understand why this is happening and how we can look at this. There are neighborhood effects, increasing in relative income of selected neighborhoods. What we find at a societal level, the increasing income inequality is now becoming translated into increasing spatial inequality across neighborhoods within cities. So there's a direct spatial parallel to this. It results in income segregation, if you will. If we look at issues around income inequality, the Gini Coefficient is the standard measurement of income inequality. And here's the Gini Coefficient from 1970 to 2010 for the 8 metro areas covered in our study. We can see that, remember I said the 1980s was a kind of a turning point, if you like, given neoliberal governance. Notice what happens, the bifurcation in the patterns since the 1980s. We see Toronto and Calgary with rapidly rising levels of income inequality. Places like Halifax, not quite so much, right? If we look at income polarization, which is a measure of the extent to which inequality is associated with spread from the middle to the poles, this is the coefficient of polarization developed by Alan Walks at the U of T. And again, we see, since the 1980s, the rapid rise in not only inequality, but in polarization as well. So lots of evidence for changing and rising levels of both inequality and polarization. A recent quick review of the 2016 census data for Alberta. This doesn't deal with neighborhoods per se, but the Parkland Institute, Rebecca McCrae, did a quick piece on this, looking at income levels across Alberta, and an interesting title, the 2016 census, Rising Tide Doesn't Lift All Boats. Interestingly, if we look at income by decile in in Alberta, in the past 5 years, from 2010 to 2015, look who's seeing gains. The change in percentage share of income by decile. Only the top decile has seen gains in their income, right? Everybody else, the losses are all being fed to the top. Again, this is the classic example of income inequality with income rising to the top. And of course, there's lots of literature about the top 1%ers and all this kind of stuff. If we look at the shares of all income by decile for 1976 to 2015, notice the pattern again. We see a slight improvement of the those at the very bottom, the lowest decile. There's been a marginal increase in their wealth, in their income levels, or share of the income, I should say. And if we look at the 9th and 10th decile, they've seen marginal gains for the ninth and more significant gains for the topmost decile. All the other deciles have lost their share of income since 1976. So this is the classic example of the erosion of the middle, right? The polarization, and particularly the upward shift to the top. In 2016, Calgary had the highest median income in the country, by far the highest, almost $25,000 above average. That's a lot. And in Calgary's top 1% of income earners lapped their poorer counterparts 62 times, 10.3 times the middle income earners, and 62 times the lowest earners in the city. So it's an astonishing increase in income, and I'll show you some more data on that in a few minutes. So let's talk briefly about the three cities idea. And again, this comes from Toronto initially. This report, as I indicated, received a lot of press attention, and it's a very, very simplistic little idea. It's a simple model based on one variable, and that is income change. If we look at some of the graphs included in that little brochure, we see the change in neighborhood income distributions. This is just for the city of Toronto, not for the metropolitan area, 1970 to 2005, and with projections to 2025. Look at the erosion of the middle. These are whether or not the incomes of neighborhoods are within 20% of the average. So in 1970, 66% of Toronto's neighborhoods were middle income. By 2025, 20% will be. At the present time, we're about 25% or something like that. And look at where has this shift gone. If we look at the decline in the middle income, notice the polarization, the rapid rise of very low income neighborhoods and the rise of very high income neighborhoods. So again, the erosion of the middle is primarily associated with the rise of some many, many more low-income neighborhoods and the rise to the top. If you look at the average individual incomes in the city of Toronto from 1970 to 1980, blue is neighborhoods with more than 20%, higher than 20% above the metro average. So the red ones are the impoverished neighborhoods, and the blue ones are the high-income neighborhoods. Notice the spatial shift in income pattern over time. It's quite remarkable, and this is the kind of graphic that just captured everybody's attention in Toronto. And wow, look at but what we see from a geographical point of view is a kind of, interestingly, an inversion of former spatial models of the city. The models of the city developed by the Chicago School at the turn of the 20th century and in the post-war period talked about the inner city as being poor and people, moving to the suburbs. The high-income people moving to the suburbs. The city and the area surrounding the central business district was classically an area for the poor. And what we're seeing is a reversal of this pattern. The central cities are now becoming the sought-after high-income areas in the city. But at the same time, the classic pattern is, and again, with this we notice this in Calgary as well, the suburbanization of poverty. Look at the 1970s, the suburbs were not poor. By 2005 and 2006, the suburbs are where we're seeing the poor. So the geography of deprivation and poverty has become inverted through time. What these three cities idea, however, links to is they computed a simple measure of income change over the time period. And in the original Toronto article, they used 20%. So they looked whether or not a neighborhood through time had increased by more than 20% from the citywide average or decreased by more than 20%. And so income declining region, income stable regions, and income gaining regions. It's basically what they classified. So city 1 is income gaining, city 2 is more or less income stable, and city 3 is income declining regions. And this image, people really, really were shocked by. And again, we see that Toronto, the central city, is becoming the sought-after place where income gains are evident. If we look at Calgary now, Calgary in 2016, 1.5 million people. It's grown really, really rapidly, right? 95% since 1991 alone. It's the most unequal, second most unequal metropolitan area. If we look at income levels in Calgary, again, notice how different it is to any other city in Canada, right? It's just phenomenal. It's a complete outlier. Individual incomes in Calgary increased by 34.7% since 1980, and Canada as a whole only increased 14.7%. In 2015, Calgary's incomes were 140% of the national average. In 1980, they were only 123% of the national average. So Calgary is really distinguished itself from other cities because of this. Obviously, this is linked to the oil and gas sector, which, of course, we can see the downturn here in the 2007 financial collapse, right? So we've looked at these graphs already. We have lots of evidence then for simultaneous inequality and polarization. If we look at Calgary's neighborhoods, and we look from 1970 to 2010, these yellow neighborhoods are the percentage of neighborhoods in the city or in the metropolitan area that are classified as middle income. In other words, they have incomes of 80 to 120% of the mean. Notice the erosion of the middle income neighborhoods in Calgary, exactly the same kind of thing we saw in Toronto. Notice through time where in 1970 only 10% of neighborhoods were considered low and very low income. Notice the rapid rise in these pink and red neighborhoods, the share of low and very low income neighborhoods. So in other words, the decline of the middle is primarily being offset by the rise of poor neighborhoods. The share of high and very high income neighborhoods has more or less stayed the same. Okay? But the increasing share of neighborhoods that are poor has increased dramatically. So this is a huge, huge issue. What's interesting to me, however, remember I said it's the rise of incomes to the very top. If we look at what's going on in the very high income neighborhoods, and we look at this through time, this is the ratio of the income in that neighborhood to the metropolitan average. So in 1970, the wealthiest neighborhood in Calgary had 1.9 times the metro average income. By 2010, it was 3.56 times the metro average, and in 2016, we just calculated this again, it's 3.7 times the metro average. So notice the rapid rise since the 1980s, of the concentration of wealth in the highest income neighborhood in Calgary. This happens to be the census tract associated with Upper Mount Royal and so forth, right? So the rise of what we might call super rich neighborhoods, this is no accident. If we look at Calgary's income, the top 1%, the ratio of the top 1% to the 10th percentile. Calgary 62 times the top 1% are earning 62 times the lowest decile, right? Remarkable. If we look at the geography of income, this is average household income in 1981 and 2006. Again, blue is high income, red is low income. Notice what this happens. This is 1981 and this is 2006. There's been a real shift. And in Calgary, I think there's been a real, if we follow this transect here, there's been a real shift, a real impoverishment of the east and the northeast of the city, and a real increasing wealth, particularly in the MDA Rocky View, for example, but it's this area of town where those super high income ratios are found. It's this neighborhood right here, where that has grown from 1.9 times to 4 times the metro average. So super concentration of wealth in the central city. If we look at individual income ratios in 1980 and 2010, again, this is the ratio of average individual income in a neighborhood to the metropolitan average. Again, we see high-income neighborhoods did exist in the central city before, but the suburbs were, doing reasonably well. Notice the consolidation and the increasing intensification of high incomes in this area around basically Upper Mount Royal and into these high-income neighborhoods of Calgary up towards Glenmore Reservoir. If we subtract this from this, in other words, take the difference between these two maps, we get a map of the change in the income ratio. And here we can see where the intensification has occurred. So the yellows and reds are income decline, relative decline, and the blue is intensification. So once again, we see the changing geography of income and the concentration of income in the central city. Very similar kinds of things that obviously were found in Toronto. So the question then, as part of our group project, we were all asked to say, well, does this three cities model hold true in our respective study areas? Should we try and replicate this? So again, it's a simple little model. We're just looking for these regions of decline, stability, and increase, and we're comparing 1970, and in this case actually 2010 income ratios. For those of you who want all the detailed documentation of the methodology we used and how we did and what the findings were, there's way more information in this report than I can talk about today. So you can go on the neighborhoodchange.ca and download the report. If we look at, basically try and simplify this map a little bit into three categories of change, we find here the blue areas have increased in their ratio by more than 10%. The yellow are the stable neighborhoods that are plus or minus 10% of the average, and the red areas are areas of decline. So compare, this is the Three Cities of Toronto model. Notice what's going on in Calgary. Almost the same, conceptually the same kind of thing. The rise of wealth in the center and the increasing suburbanization of poverty in the city. If we look at Calgary compared to the other metro areas, it's kind of interesting. Smallest share of income stable, only 21% of Calgary's neighborhoods remained income stable, and 49% were income decline. The largest share of income declining neighborhoods of any city in Canada. So this is telling us that not only is there the erosion of the middle in Calgary and the rise of incomes to the very top, but we have seen in Calgary, compared to other places, the rapid rise of poor neighborhoods, right? Or income declining neighborhoods. This means that spatially, income is becoming more segregated into different segments. This is the kind of quartering of the city that the divided cities folks talk about. So, given that there is evidence for these three distinctive kinds of regions in Calgary, the increasing center, the kind of declining share, but a few stable neighborhoods in the sort of middle suburbs, and increasing impoverishment in the suburbs, the question is, are there significant social differences according to these regions of income change? Now, I won't bore you. I'm going to flip through these quickly. I won't bore you with the details here. Basically, what we did, we assembled a whole bunch of different social indicators, things associated with educational levels, labor force characteristics, income ratios, household incomes, families living below the low-income cutoff. What else? Age structure, household size and household configuration, immigrant and ethnic things like percentage visible minorities and so on. And for all of these different variables, we carried out some ANOVA tests. I won't bore you with all the details. All of these, the ones that are shown here, are significant at less than 0.05. And this shows you that between City 1 and City 3, for example, there's significant differences, and between City 2 and City 3, these were based on some post hoc tests of the ANOVA analysis. So I'll try and summarize this in a better framework. We looked at mobility, people's mobility through town. We looked at housing characteristics, the age of housing stock, the type and configuration of housing, whether it was apartments or single family homes, persons per bedroom, dwellings needing major repairs as a kind of an indicator of substandardness, many different indicators here. So I'll try and summarize this now by only looking at the key differences between income gaining, the blue, and income declining. City 1 is gaining, and city 3 is declining neighborhoods. So if we kind of group these sort of variables, if you like, these are generally socioeconomic status kinds of variables, right? We can see that income gaining regions have significantly higher income levels, significantly higher levels of education. This is all the census tracts that fall within those regions, by the way, right? Significantly higher shares of people employed in professional managerial jobs, significantly lower shares of people employed in sales and service occupation, and significantly lower shares of people in trades. Of course, this is the opposite. So clearly there are some, important income gaining regions are high income, highly educated, high socioeconomic status neighborhoods. Family status kinds of characteristics. So look at children. Income gaining regions have significantly lower share of children in the neighborhood, significantly lower share of, I guess you might call this late middle age, like me, right? And significantly higher shares of young adults, interestingly, right? So we'll come back to the issue of young adults, important because it's about, I think central cities now, where all the income gain is happening, is becoming a competitive struggle between seniors and millennials, right, for housing allocation now. Anyway, so there's significantly higher shares of young adults in the gaining areas, and significantly higher share of single-person households. Significantly fewer single female parent families. So again, notice in declining regions, the opposite characteristics are true. It's in the impoverished suburbs or income declining suburbs that we find children, late middle age, multiple person households, and single moms, right? And ethnic characteristics. If we look at City 1, has significantly lower shares of visible minorities, immigrants, and people of Arab West Asian descent, more significantly higher British, and lower foreign language. Declining regions, in contrast, is where we find high concentrations of visible minorities and immigrants, people of Arab and West Asian descent, and people whose mother tongue is not English or French. And again, mobility patterns for people who've moved residence within the last 5 years, significantly higher levels of mobility, interestingly, in income gaining regions. This is because people returning to the central city, primarily the new condoization of downtowns in Canadian cities, high demand for things. If you look at Calgary, the condo development on both the west end of the downtown and now in the East Village area of Calgary is absolutely phenomenal. Go take a look next time you're in Calgary, what's going on east of City Hall. It's phenomenal. And if we look at the housing stock, in income gaining regions, we got significantly higher rental, significantly higher older housing stock, again, which is becoming gentrified, and significantly higher new housing. So this is an interesting connection. In these income gaining regions, you've got old housing and the new juxtaposed together. This is the Hillhurst Sunnyside, is a classic kind of example of this, right, of gentrifying neighborhoods. In the poor income declining region, again, the opposite characteristics, but housing affordability stress, this is an indicator of housing affordability stress, housing cost ratio. We were interested in the percentage of households spending more than 30% and more than 50% of their income on shelter costs. And of course, in these income declining regions of Calgary, you find significantly higher shelter burden costs in declining regions. All right, a couple more minutes. Calgary's three cities and the divided cities. What does this tell us? So what have we seen here? If we look at where this income transformation is taking place, right? Increasing center, concentration of wealth and incomes, and rising incomes, significantly high incomes in here, and declining incomes here. This particular neighborhood is a real significant decline. What's going on at the same time of this? Well, gentrification is one of the big drivers of this, obviously, but gentrification has been going on for 30 years in Calgary now, right? The return to the central city. There's lots of literature in urban geography and urban studies about the return to the center. The central city, unlike the city of the 1950s, is a desirable place. and people want this for amenity-rich environments, restaurants and bistros and cultural activities with the central city. There's also lots of recent literature concerning the youthification of central cities. One of our colleagues, Marcus Moose, who is involved in a thesis project on this project, has written extensively about the youthification of central cities, and it's this idea that the young people, particularly the younger millennials, have this real desire to live in the central city. They don't want cars, they don't want the nuisance, they want to be live in central cities, fast-paced, pedestrian-oriented kinds of worlds. They don't want the suburbs of the baby boomers. The condoization of Canadian cities is going full blast, and this is linked to lifestyle changes, the rise of single-person households, the delay of marriage and cohabitation, and so on. But also, as other geographers have written, the creative class wants to be in the central city with cultural amenities, and is a key driver of the development of those kinds of cultural amenities as well. And of course, in Calgary, just like in Toronto, we also see, if you will, not necessarily the suburbanization of poverty, although that is happening, but the suburbanization of income decline. So when I very quickly reviewed some of these changes in socioeconomic status variables and family status variables, ethnic variables, and so forth, clearly there's some attributes that seem to go hand in hand with income gain and income decline, the geography of that change, if you will. So, we've looked at these different things, and certainly there is a new spatial order. If we think about the association between high ratios of ethnic minorities and visible minorities and people whose mother tongue is not English or French, strongly correlated with the geography of decline. If we think about, the wealthy, the educated, the high socioeconomic status, single-person households associated with the city of gaining incomes. Is there a new spatial order? I would say I'm not quite sure. It's evolving for sure. It's troubling, but I think there's some problematic signs that we need to kind of think about as we think about policy and changes in our cities. Obviously, in regions of decline, there are strong associations, significant associations between neighborhood social attributes with what we might call vulnerable populations. Who are these people living in regions of decline? Visible minorities, racial minorities, recent immigrants, the working poor, those of limited education, people facing language barriers, service sector workers, the so-called precariat, right? And people experiencing tremendous housing affordability stress. Just as an example, in the 2016 census, we find there's a couple of neighborhoods in Calgary. Well, one neighborhood has more than 90% of its population is visible minority, one census tract. There are 38 neighborhoods or census tracts in Calgary that have a majority minority, visible minority population. So the visible minorities are more than 50% of the local population in 38 different census tracts in Calgary now. And when you look at that on a map, in fact, it's basically all the northeastern sector of the city, which a newspaper article recently described that as what's becoming known as Brown Calgary. The whole northeast segment, if I can do my page, is there a page up thing here? No. If you look here, this whole part of Calgary over here is, when you look at visible minority patterns, it's extremely, extremely high. And some people are beginning, you remember that divide, that socioeconomic divide that's increasing. This whole part of the city is increasingly referred to as Brown Calgary. Again, this is Rebecca McCrae's words. It's true, I think, right? Significant inequalities are building in Alberta, right? It's not, and it's tremendous. The richest 1% and the rest of us, it's a different world for them compared to us. When we dig beneath the veneer of the success story of Alberta and the resource-based economy, the rising tide, energy-related incomes does not float all boats. Many, many neighborhoods are becoming poorer and poorer as a result. So I want to return to this word, invidious. remember how Marcuse described it. If you look in a dictionary, an action or situation likely to arouse or incur resentment or anger in others. I wonder if this new kind of spatial unfolding of inequality within the city will lead to more and more resentment, anger, and social violence in the future. It's a form of spatial inequality that's directly linked to what we would call vertical segregation, labor market, failure to integrate into the labor market, income inequality, income segregation, leads to horizontal segregation of the poor. So do Canadian metropolitan areas reflect an emerging socio-spatial representation, a new spatial order? I think we're seeing the early signs of it, for sure. And, is it the natural order of things in a capitalist economy for this kind of social injustice and spatial injustice to occur hand in hand? Now, this, for those of you who read my emails, this is the signature, the bottom piece is the signature piece on my email, and I've had it there for many, many years. It's a lovely quotation from Charles Darwin. If the misery of our poor be caused not by the laws of nature, but by our institutions, great is our sin. So I would challenge all of us to say, what kind of institutional restructuring do we need to eliminate some of this kind of spatial unfolding of inequality and injustice? Thank you.